The Baker Hotel rises like a monument from another age. 14 stories of Spanish colonial revival elegance, towering over a town that no longer knows what to do with it. From the street, it still looks proud, almost royal. But the windows are dark, and the silence is so complete you can feel it. This place has been many things: a luxury resort, a medical destination, a convention palace, a war-era oasis, and finally, a ruin that refuses to disappear. And here's what makes its story different. The Baker Hotel isn't famous because something violent happened inside. It's famous because nothing dramatic had to happen at all. The tragedy here was slow, the kind of tragedy that doesn't make headlines because it starts with hope. People once arrived in mineral wells carrying pain, fear, exhaustion, and the private desperation of illnesses they didn't know how to fix. They came because the town promised something that sounded like science and felt like faith: mineral-rich water, therapeutic baths, and a full regimen of rest and treatments that would restore them. And in a world with limited medical solutions, that promise was powerful enough to build an empire. For a while, the Baker Hotel truly did feel like a healing palace. Guests slept in luxury, soaked in warm baths, drank from springs, and left feeling renewed, sometimes because the environment helped, sometimes because rest helps, and sometimes because belief itself can change how the body feels. But that belief was the foundation, and when a foundation is belief, it can collapse in a single generation. Because eventually, medicine changed. Evidence replaced testimonials, and what was once the cure became a story people smiled at, then stopped paying for, then stopped traveling for. So when you look at the Baker Hotel today, you're not just looking at an abandoned building. You're looking at what happens when an entire town builds its future on a miracle, and the miracle runs out. And to understand how something this grand could fall so completely, we have to go back to the era when America was desperate to believe in miracles. The 1920s were a decade of motion. Cities grew upward, technology spread outward, and Americans felt like the future could be engineered fast. But beneath the jazz and the optimism was a quieter truth. If you got seriously sick, you didn't have many reliable options. There were doctors, yes. There were hospitals, yes. But for many conditions, medicine still couldn't offer a clear solution. People lived with chronic pain, infections, and long-term illness as if it were fate. And when real answers are limited, the human mind becomes a marketplace for hope. Across America, mineral springs turned into an industry. Towns built reputations around water the way modern cities build brands around universities or tech. Resorts sprang up near natural wells. Bathhouses promised relief. Advertisements used confident language, scientific words, and impressive-sounding mineral charts. And because many people felt better after resting, soaking in warm water, eating regular meals, and stepping away from daily stress, the story seemed to confirm itself. The water must be working. But what really worked most of the time was the environment, the rest, the routine, the comfort, the simple human reality that when you slow down, your body often stops screaming quite as loudly. And then there's belief, because belief is not imaginary. Belief can change perception. Belief can change mood. Belief can change how pain feels. In an age that trusted testimonials more than trials, belief was the evidence. So mineral springs became the American shortcut to health, part folk remedy, part luxury vacation, part social status. You didn't just go to get better, you went to be seen getting better. You went to join a culture that promised renewal. And in Texas, a small town stumbled into this national obsession almost by accident.
Mineral wells didn't begin as a glamorous destination. It was a small settlement shaped by Texas weather, hard work, and modest expectations. Then, in the late 1800s, people drilling for ordinary water struck something different. Water so saturated with minerals, it tasted sharp and metallic, leaving residue behind like chalk. To some, it seemed unpleasant. To others, it seemed unique. And in a marketplace hungry for miracles, unique is step one toward healing. Stories spread, first locally, then regionally. Claims multiplied the way rumors do when they offer comfort. People said aches eased, stomachs settled, skin improved, and one legend became the cornerstone, the claim that the water restored a woman's sanity, giving the town its most famous phrase, "crazy water." Whether the story was true didn't matter nearly as much as what it did. It gave people permission to believe. Soon, visitors arrived, then more. Bathhouses opened, wells were drilled and tested, bottled water businesses grew. Doctors, sometimes sincerely, sometimes under social pressure, began suggesting mineral wells as a health destination. And like many booming trends, the town's success started to depend on one fragile thing: continued belief. Because if the water wasn't truly miraculous, if it was mostly rest, routine, and the placebo effect, then the town's economy was built on a promise that could be outpaced by real medicine. But at the time, that risk felt invisible. All anyone could see was growth. Mineral Wells was ready for its crown jewel. It needed a palace that could compete with the great resorts of the nation. It needed a builder bold enough to make the promise look permanent.
Theodore Brasher Baker understood something most people miss about hotels. Guests don't only pay for a room, they pay for a feeling. They pay for the story they get to tell afterward. By the early 1920s, Baker had already proven himself in Texas. He knew how to build a landmark, something that didn't simply serve a city, but reshaped its identity. When Baker put his name on a building, the building became a symbol. It told outsiders, this place matters. When local leaders in Mineral Wells approached him, they didn't just offer money, they offered a stage. They wanted a hotel grand enough to validate their town's reputation, and they wanted the profits to stay local. Baker saw the opportunity instantly, a luxury resort fused with a health destination, an experience people would travel for. And he didn't want a nice hotel, he wanted a healing palace. So he brought in serious design, Spanish colonial revival architecture, towers, arches, ornamentation that made the building feel older than it was, as if it belonged to history already. The Baker Hotel would rise above the town like an announcement. It would be visible from miles away. It would say, Mineral Wells isn't a small town anymore, it's a destination. But Baker's greatest strength, his instinct to go bigger, would also become the seed of the tragedy. Because the bigger the promise, the more expensive it becomes to keep that promise alive.
Construction began with excitement, money, and momentum. Steel rose, the foundation formed, the town watched its future take shape in real time. Then, Baker did something that perfectly captured who he was. He stopped it. While traveling, Baker saw a hotel with a feature still rare at the time, a swimming pool. Not just as decoration, an attraction. And he immediately understood what it meant for Mineral Wells. A pool wasn't just leisure. A pool could become proof. Proof that the healing waters were not just a drink, not just a bath, but a full experience, a ritual in a grand setting. So he ordered a redesign, an Olympic-size pool filled with mineral water. It was costly, it was complicated, it forced structural changes, it delayed timelines, but Baker didn't hesitate, because he wasn't only building a hotel, he was building belief, and belief thrives on spectacle. This decision turned the Baker Hotel into a true gamble. If the healing culture stayed strong, the hotel would print money and make mineral wells legendary. If the culture changed, the baker would become an enormous machine designed for a world that no longer existed. In 1929, nobody wanted to imagine that second outcome, not while the palace was rising, not while America still believed the future would always go up.
The Baker Hotel opened in November of 1929, right as America's optimism began to fracture. The stock market crash had just jolted the nation. Anxiety was spreading fast. But inside the Baker, the atmosphere was the opposite. Elegance, music, confidence. For guests entering the lobby, it must have felt like stepping into a different reality. This wasn't just nice. This was engineered luxury, design meant to overwhelm you with comfort. Hundreds of rooms, ballrooms high enough to make your voice feel important. A spa system built into the identity of the building. And then there were the innovations, details that made the place feel futuristic. Cold water circulating systems, room conveniences, discreet service features, and a level of planning that made guests feel cared for before they even asked. But the true heart of the Baker wasn't a ballroom, it wasn't the lobby, it was the healing center. Treatments presented with professional confidence, procedures wrapped in authority, and that mineral water pool, an attraction designed to turn therapy into a spectacle. The Baker didn't just offer a stay, it offered transformation. Arrive one person, leave another. And for a time, people believed exactly that. In the 1930s, while much of America struggled, the Baker Hotel thrived in a way that almost didn't make sense. But it did make sense if you understand what the Baker sold. During hard times, people don't stop spending money on everything. They stop spending on luxuries that feel optional. But they keep spending on things that feel necessary, like relief, like escape, like hope. The Baker was hope with marble floors. Guests came for rest, comfort, and the belief that their bodies could improve. The treatments felt structured and serious. Mineral baths, wraps, massages, routines that gave people the sense they were doing something real. And many did feel better because rest and routine can be powerful. If you remove stress, improve sleep, eat consistently, and spend days focused on recovery, your system responds. Then there was fame. The Baker became a magnet for notable visitors, people who helped build legend around a place. Once a hotel becomes where important people go, the hotel becomes a story, and stories sell. The ballrooms hosted dances, the pool echoed with life, the spa stayed busy. Mineral wells didn't just have a hotel, it had a cultural engine. But beneath all of it was a fragile dependency. The treatments had to remain believable. Not forever, just long enough for the town to build something sustainable beyond them. And that's where the tragedy begins, because the town didn't diversify fast enough. The Baker was too successful at making one promise feel permanent.
Progress doesn't always explode into a town like a storm. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of better options. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, medicine began shifting into something more evidence-based. New drugs, new standards, new expectations. It wasn't that people immediately stopped visiting mineral springs, it's that the cultural certainty started to soften. A person who once would have traveled for weeks to soak in mineral baths might now find help closer to home. A doctor who once recommended the waters might now recommend new treatments first and the waters second. The Baker's healing promise began transforming into a wellness experience, still pleasant, still relaxing, but no longer essential. And when a destination stops being essential, it has to compete like any other destination. It needs constant novelty. It needs marketing power. It needs guests year-round for the right reasons.
The Baker was huge. Its costs were huge. Its staffing needs were huge. Its business model wasn't built for maybe. It was built for belief. And belief was starting to fade. Here's the cruel twist. While the Baker Hotel built reputation and served crowds, the man behind it couldn't outrun the economic reality of the era. T.B. Baker faced financial collapse and bankruptcy within a few years of the hotel's opening. Ownership changed hands, management shifted. The building stayed, but the original visionary energy didn't. The hotel could still operate, and it still attracted guests, but a palace like this needs more than basic operation. It needs momentum. It needs expansion into new markets. It needs a plan for what happens when the original promise weakens. Without that plan, the Baker began drifting. Still beautiful, still impressive, but increasingly vulnerable to any major change in American life. And a major change was about to arrive, one that would temporarily save the Baker while hiding the real problem. World War II transformed small towns across America, and mineral wells was no exception. With the opening of a massive training base nearby, the town's population surged. Soldiers arrived by the thousands. Weekends flooded downtown. Every business expanded. Every room became valuable. The Baker Hotel entered a boom period, possibly its most profitable era. The ballrooms filled with dances and ceremonies, the restaurants ran constantly. The building became a haven of comfort in a world full of uncertainty. But notice what changed. These guests weren't coming for mineral cures. They were coming because the Baker was the biggest, best place to stay in the area. The hotel's core identity, healing, was no longer the engine. The war years were a mask. The Baker looked healthier than ever, but it was being kept alive by a temporary population wave. When the wave ended, the truth would return. And when it returned fast. After the war, the base scaled down. The surge faded. Mineral wells returned toward its older size. The Baker, built to serve a constant stream of visitors, faced a brutal reality. It needed more demand than the town could generate. There were attempts to keep momentum. Events, gatherings, conventions, and for brief moments it worked. The Baker could still host crowds. It could still look alive. But looking alive isn't the same as being sustainable. Because the travel world was changing. America was becoming faster. People were becoming more mobile. And the kind of slow, ritual-based health tourism that built mineral wells was becoming outdated. The Baker didn't fail in a single dramatic moment. It failed the way old systems fail, quietly, under the pressure of a new world. The interstate highway era changed everything. Travelers no longer needed to detour into downtowns to find a grand hotel. Motels appeared along the roads, cheap, simple, convenient. Families could drive farther in a day. Business travelers chose speed over spectacle. Spa towns across the country struggled. The mineral water craze that once built economies became a historical curiosity. People didn't stop caring about wellness, they just stopped believing in miracle claims. And the Baker Hotel had one huge problem. It was too big to be just a hotel. The heating, maintenance, staffing, and sheer operational complexity of a 14-story palace demanded consistent high occupancy. Occasional conventions weren't enough. Weekend events weren't enough. The Baker was a machine built for another era's mindset, and you can't convince the future to behave like the past.
By the early 1960s, the reality became unavoidable. The Baker Hotel closed. For mineral wells, this wasn't just a business closing. This was identity collapsing. Imagine living in a town where the skyline is dominated by a palace, and then the palace goes dark. The emotional impact is hard to describe. A building like this isn't just architecture. It's pride. It's history. It's proof you mattered. There were brief attempts to revive it, moments of hope, but the math didn't change. And then, in a moment that felt almost symbolic, one of the key figures tied to the hotel's later era died within the building itself, like the story folding in on itself. By the early 1970s, the Baker closed again, this time for what felt like the final time. And that's when the hotel stopped being a business and became something else, a monument.
From the outside, the Baker remained impressive. From the inside, decay moved like weather. Windows broke, rain entered, ceilings collapsed, water damage spread. The pool that once symbolized innovation became an empty scar. Time turned elegance into rubble, one layer at a time. And then a new kind of visitor arrived. Explorers with cameras searching for ruins. Images spread. The Baker became internet famous, not as a healing palace, but as a frozen time capsule. Ghost stories followed because humans struggled to accept emptiness without turning it into narrative. People don't like to say, this place died because the world changed. They prefer something stayed behind. But the truth is, the Baker didn't need ghosts to be unsettling. It was unsettling because it represented wasted certainty. A town once believed it had found a miracle, and then history proved the miracle was mostly a mirror. People once traveled to mineral wells seeking healing. Decades later, people traveled there seeking the feeling of standing inside a dream that collapsed. And then, finally, hope returned, this time wearing hard hats and blueprints. Restoration plans brought the Baker back into the world of the living, at least on paper. Investors promised revival. The town committed money. Headlines returned. The Baker was going to be beautiful again. But restoration is not just construction. Restoration is economics. It's demand. It's the question of whether people will show up consistently, year after year, for the new reason you're selling. And that's where the story circles back to its central theme, belief. In the 1920s, belief was mineral water. In the modern era, belief is nostalgia, heritage tourism, luxury retreats, weddings, conventions, wellness without miracle claims. The language is safer. The promise is more realistic, but the risk remains. Can a restored palace sustain itself in a small town? Or does it become a beautiful empty building instead of a decaying one? No matter what happens, the Baker Hotel's story is already a warning carved into the skyline. It teaches what happens when hope becomes an industry. It shows how quickly belief can create prosperity and how brutally reality can erase it. The Baker wasn't haunted by murder. It was haunted by the moment America stopped needing the kind of miracle it sold. And maybe that's the most unsettling truth of all. Sometimes the thing that destroys a palace isn't evil, it's progress.